King Tutankhamun survived more than 3,000 years inside a sealed tomb. When it was opened in 1922 in the Valley of the Kings, everything appeared untouched. The coffins, the wrappings, the body. But within a few years of that discovery, the mummy was no longer intact. Parts of it had been separated. Bones were missing. The chest had been opened, and the head had been detached, and none of this had happened in ancient times. It happened after the tomb was found. For decades, this wasn't the part of the story people focused on. The discovery itself became the center of attention: the gold, the mask, the thousands of objects packed into the burial. But the condition of the body told a different story, because when archaeologists first reached the mummy, this was supposed to be one of the best preserved royal burials ever discovered. The tomb had remained sealed for over 3,000 years. No looters had broken in. Nothing had been disturbed. And yet, by the time the examination was complete, the most famous mummy in the world had been taken apart. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to the moment the tomb was first opened and what they found there. There was no sign of the kind of damage archaeologists had come to expect. For years, Howard Carter had searched the Valley of the Kings, convinced that one royal burial had somehow escaped both looters and time itself. Most had already assumed it was gone, emptied, lost, or never completed. But behind a sealed entrance buried beneath layers of debris, the structure of the tomb was still intact. When Carter finally looked in, what stood out wasn't damage. It was how deliberate everything appeared. Objects hadn't been scattered or stripped away, but arranged tightly, almost deliberately, as if the burial had only just been completed and the chamber sealed behind it. Furniture, chariots, statues, filling the space in a way that suggested no one had ever returned. Further in, past a series of closed doorways, were the coffins. 3 of them, nested one inside the other, each layer heavier and more elaborate, until only the innermost remained. By the time they reached it, there was little reason to expect anything out of place. The wrappings were still intact. The ornaments hadn't been removed. Even the smallest details appeared undisturbed. It was, in every visible way, a burial left exactly as it had been sealed. And that was what made the next step difficult to explain, because when they began to examine the mummy itself, the problem wasn't something that had happened to the tomb. It was something that had already taken hold within it. At first, there was no obvious reason to expect difficulty. The outer layers could be examined. The wrappings were still in place, the shape of the body preserved beneath them exactly as it had been left thousands of years earlier. Even reaching this point had taken time. Each layer had been removed carefully, one after another, until the final layer was reached, the point where the examination could finally begin. The expectation was straightforward. The body would be lifted, documented, and examined. Instead, the first attempt stopped almost immediately. There was no movement, no shift in position, nothing to suggest that the body was separate from the surface beneath it. At first, it didn't seem unusual. The wrappings could have settled over time. The weight alone might have been enough to hold everything in place. So they tried again, more carefully this time, applying pressure where it would normally allow the body to loosen, testing whether any part of it could be moved without strain. Nothing changed. The resistance wasn't limited to one point. It was the same across the entire surface. The body didn't respond as something resting within a coffin, because this wasn't a matter of handling something fragile. It was something they couldn't remove at all, at least not in the way they had expected, which left them with a problem that had no simple solution. They couldn't leave it where it was, and they couldn't take it out intact. At that point, the discovery had already drawn global attention. The objects inside the tomb were being catalogued, studied, prepared for removal, and the body itself was part of that process. What made the situation more complicated wasn't just that the body couldn't be removed. It was what remained beneath the wrappings. The burial had not been arranged as a single object, but as a layered system, where items were placed directly onto the body itself. Amulets positioned across the chest and throat, jewelry wrapped into the linen, smaller objects set between layers that had not been disturbed since the tomb was sealed. Some of these were visible, but many were not, concealed beneath wrappings that had remained intact for more than 3,000 years. And there were far more of them than it first appeared, placed deliberately, each with a specific position as part of the burial itself. Reaching them was not optional, because the examination wasn't limited to what could be seen from the outside. It extended to everything that had been placed within those layers, which meant the body couldn't simply be left as it was, and it couldn't be removed without disturbing the structure that held everything together. At that point, the problem was no longer just technical. It became a decision, whether to preserve the body exactly as it had been found, or to proceed with the examination, knowing that doing so would inevitably alter it. Once that decision had been made, the approach changed. The body was no longer treated as something that could be removed in one piece, but as something that had to be worked through gradually, layer by layer. The wrappings were the first to be addressed. Sections were cut and lifted with care, exposing what lay beneath them, not only the form of the body, but the objects placed as part of the burial itself. In some areas, those objects could be recovered without resistance. In others, they could not be separated at all. As the work continued, it became clear that certain parts would not respond to careful handling alone, and the method had to change. Heated tools were introduced and applied to specific points where the material refused to give, allowing the outer layers to be loosened just enough for the process to continue. This was not done quickly. It moved in stages, with each step intended to recover what had been placed there while avoiding unnecessary damage, but the structure itself could not be preserved. To reach what lay deeper, parts of the body had to be separated. The limbs were detached at the joints, while sections of the torso were opened to allow access to what had been placed across and beneath it. The chest was cut through for the same reason. Even the head was removed, not as a separate act, but as part of the same process, continuing the examination where it could not proceed otherwise. By the time it was complete, the body was no longer in the condition it had been found. It had been taken apart piece by piece in order to reach what had been placed within it. And once the process ended, the remains were reassembled as closely as possible and returned to the coffin, restoring a form that resembled how it had originally been found, at least from the outside. But it was no longer the same. The structure had been altered, not in a way that was immediately visible, but in a way that could not be reversed. What had once been a single, intact burial was now something that had been taken apart and reconstructed. At the time, this did not stand out as unusual. The focus remained on the discovery itself, the objects, the craftsmanship, the scale of what had been uncovered. The condition of the body was recorded, but it was not treated as central. It was part of the process, and that distinction mattered. Because once the attention shifted to what had been recovered, what had been changed became easier to overlook. The tomb continued to be studied, the artifacts displayed, and the discovery itself became one of the most well-known events in the history of archaeology. And over time, the state of the mummy, what had been done to it, and what that implied, faded into the background of the story. That began to change decades later. In 1968, the first X-ray studies were carried out, offering a view beneath the surface without disturbing what remained. What they revealed was not a single intact body, but one that had already been altered. Sections displaced, elements missing, the structure no longer continuous. At the time, this raised questions, but it did not fully resolve them. It wasn't until much later, in 2005, that a more detailed examination became possible. Using CT scanning, researchers were able to study the body in thousands of cross-sectional images, reconstructing its internal condition without reopening the wrappings. What had once required direct access could now be observed without contact. The same questions could be answered without separating the body, without altering its structure. And with that came a clearer understanding of what had been done. The limbs had been separated, the torso opened and sections removed that had once formed a continuous structure. Details that had been recorded in fragments could now be seen as part of a single, deliberate process. What had once been described piece by piece could now be understood as a sequence of actions rather than isolated damage. For the first time, the full extent of the changes became clear, not only what had been done, but how it had been done and why. And with that, the discovery itself could no longer be seen in quite the same way. The tomb had remained sealed for more than 3,000 years. Everything inside had endured exactly as it had been left, until it was opened. And from that moment on, it was never the same again. Not because it disappeared, but because it was changed. And the question is, did they ever really have a choice?